Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Cesar Perales has spent 5 years serving the public as an advocate, an activist, and an administrator. He recently became president of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, an organization he helped found more than 30 years ago. And you were, at that time, the first executive director, right?
That's right.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's nice to see you.
So when was it founded? 30 years ago would make
1972.
And why was it founded?
Well, at that time, Puerto Ricans were the only real Latino group in New York City. It was a time in which civil rights was the issue of the times, and there was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Out west, there was the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and a couple of other lawyers and myself, one of whom you know, Victor Marrero.
Right, who became a federal judge.
Who became a federal judge. We formed the organization. He became the first chair, and I was the first executive director.
And then what did you do?
Well, we had a wonderful time. We sued many people. We established the right to bilingual education. We established the right to bilingual ballots. In those days, you know, it was only in English, and we actually had to sue a guy who ran the elections, a guy named Dinkins, was then in charge of the election board. We sued him and established the right to bilingual elections. And
do we still have that?
Oh yeah. You know, if you go into the polling place today.
That's right. That's right. I got a thing about my name in Chinese when I ran. I ran as a dean delegate in Chinese, and they got it wrong. They had the wrong middle initial.
Well, anyway, that did not exist back in 1972.
That's so interesting.
And so we brought litigation on the theory, of course, that Puerto Ricans, as American citizens, voted in Spanish in Puerto Rico.
Oh, that's
but
right.
when they moved to New York, could not vote because they did not understand some of the things on the ballot. And so I think the courts agreed with us, and then later extended it to all other language minorities. But it was originally...
Which was a whole different story, because they're
not citizens.
Right.
But Ted Kennedy, who was then in the Senate, made it national law as an amendment to the Voting Rights Act. But we take pride in being the ones that brought on that litigation. We even brought lawsuits here in New York against the Civil Service Commission because they had height requirements for cops. And we had a lot of short Puerto Ricans who wanted to be cops. Today, it's primarily women who come in under the old height requirement, but in those days...
And how many Puerto Ricans are there on the police force?
Oh, there are lots today.
Right.
I think you'll see...
That's a very good proportion. So, now you're back.
Yes.
Near the president. And the Puerto Ricans aren't the largest of the Latino population, the largest segment, right?
Right.
So what happens now?
Well, we're the single largest group, but we're no longer the majority. I think in the last census, we were something like 37%, followed by Dominicans, then Mexicans, then Ecuadorians. But as a group, Latinos are 27% of New York City, growing rapidly. And we've got as much work today as we did years ago. This time, the added issue, of course, is the status, the legal status of some of the Latinos in New York who are here undocumented.
And that's the big difference between Puerto Ricans and the other Latinos.
Absolutely. And at this point, I think Puerto Ricans have to some extent matured and moved up the socioeconomic ladder. Although there are still some rather special issues that I think you'd identify with, you know, glass ceiling issues and things of that nature that I think Puerto Ricans are concerned about.
Have Puerto Ricans assimilated more into the white society than, for instance, African Americans?
I don't know that I can answer that. What I do think has happened because is that both African Americans and Puerto Ricans have improved their socioeconomic situation over the last 30 years. There's been a larger middle class.
Middle class, that's a major difference.
Yeah,
right?
and I think we have to thank affirmative action. I know it's a dirty word in some places, but I think affirmative action did make a substantial difference and opened up some doors that more people have been able to take advantage of.
So then affirmative action's grandchild or something, what is that called, diversification?
Diversity.
Diversity.
We just talk about diversity.
Right. That does help still.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that we do at our office, which we did from the very beginning, is we have a program that focuses on getting young people into law school as a way of developing leadership. And the law schools continue to be very interested in attracting Latinos and other people of color into the law schools. And I think that's fabulous. I think that much of the leadership in this country are people who become lawyers. So anybody listening to the program, call the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund if you're interested in going to law school.
Now, where did you grow up?
I was born and bred in New York. My mother's Dominican, my father's Puerto Rican.
Huh.
So
that's a good combination.
It is a good combination.
And where in New York?
On 143rd Street on the west side.
Oh, boy. And so then you went to school. Did you go to public schools?
No, I went to Catholic schools, but I ended up at CCNY. And then at Fordham Law School.
You're a City College graduate. That's very good.
A la Guru is, I think, our chant.
I went to the High School of Music and Art, which used to be next to it.
Next door,
right?
yes.
Yeah, so I always had a special feeling for City College. Were you there when they had Lewison Stadium and all of that?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
They were great times. So then you did that, but you've had an amazing career in public life.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Was the first thing that you did what was it, in Model Cities in the Lindsay administration?
Yes. Yes, I was general counsel. It was there that I spent the nights figuring out how to create the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. But I went back to government later.
Well, don't tell us that. You were really committed to Model Cities,
weren't you? I was, but I'm suggesting
that. What was that program? It was a very interesting program.
It was, and it was a Republican version, I think, of the war on poverty.
Yeah.
In which the concept was to identify areas, communities, and to focus federal support there. And John Lindsay was our mayor at the time, and he appointed a black judge by the name of Joseph B. Williams from Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I had appeared as a young lawyer before Joseph B. Williams, and he asked me to join him and to leave legal services. And that was my first exposure to government. It was a wonderful experience. But I jokingly said that from there, having spent a couple of years there, is where I met Victor Marrero, who was then also in the Model Cities program, which is why I made that joke about we spent nights figuring out.
You're right. No, I didn't mean that. I just meant it was a very good time though in life. It was exciting time because you knew you tried to change the world. You knew you could really do some things that made a difference.
Exactly.
You became a lawyer to do that? I mean, I'm always interested in how people choose to do something.
Well, I mean, in some ways, somebody suggested it's almost by default. You know, you grow up in a family like mine, and you tell them that you're majoring in liberal arts, and they look at you like you're crazy. That what is this? You're going to college to study liberal arts? So after my second year, my mother and father were driving me nuts that they didn't understand what this was.
What was your father doing, and what was your mother doing?
My father was a mannequin maker and my mother worked off and on in different factories in the garment industry. I finally had to say to them, well, I'm going to be a lawyer. And so that they understood and that they respected.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, I have to, while I was always attracted to the law, it was almost by default. I had to explain to somebody what it was that I was doing in college. And I found myself going to Fordham Law School.
Were they interested in causes and things?
My father was. My mother just wanted to make sure that I became a professional and made money. My father was much more sensitive to issues of discrimination and the treatment of people.
Yeah. So you went to legal services before, legal aid or legal services?
Legal services.
And then to the Lindsay administration, and then to Washington?
Well, I was...
Oh, then you went to the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund?
But I ended up in Washington during the Jimmy Carter administration. At the beginning of the Jimmy Carter administration, I was running the regional office of what was then HEW. And then by the end, they asked me to come down and take on the role of an assistant secretary, which was a major promotion. And I was an assistant secretary for Health and Human Services during the last year of the Carter administration. Came back, spent time at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund again because they had nobody running the place. And after a couple of years, Mario Cuomo was elected governor. And given that we had met while I was an assistant secretary doing social services work, he nominated me to be the commissioner of social services, and I spent 9 years with the Cuomo administration.
9 years, that's a long time. That was good. You're a tough guy.
Yeah, I might even have stayed longer, except that David Dinkins was then mayor.
And then you came here as a deputy mayor.
Exactly.
How long, did you stay through the 4 years?
No, the last 2 years.
The last 2 years, right.
And that was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. Do you like, now, so you've worked at all three branches of the city government. And the city, you like the city best?
The city is the toughest,
Yeah.
by far. The further away you are.
Right, you're right
from
in the middle
action.
of the people you're governing.
Absolutely.
Instantaneous response.
Absolutely, and you've got to have the ability to communicate immediately to the mayor, because you know that there's a reporter that's going to catch up with him and ask him a question about why was this child in foster care killed, or what's happening in those the Health and Hospitals Corporation, and so you've got to be constantly at the mayor's ear to tell him this is what this is why this happened, and this is how you can explain it, because they're going to come after you on this issue.
So what is the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund going to do in the future? What are we doing now?
We're doing lots of exciting things. One of the things that we're very focused on, which brings us back to the question you asked about the differences in the population, is the issue of Mexican day laborers. Those are when you see groups of young men standing on corners waiting to be picked up. Well, in Freehold, New Jersey, the actual government began to harass them, ticket them. It was terrible. And we obviously raised the constitutional question of the right of people to congregate, to assemble, and the freedom of speech, to be able to speak to people about getting jobs. And we've gotten an order from the judge allowing these people to continue to seek employment. But it's an issue that is very widespread. I think you probably heard that in Long Island there was...
Oh, right. I remember going out there. And my husband, Jimmy Breslin, wrote a book about it. It's called, you'll have to read it.
I will.
The Short, Sweet Dream of Eduardo Gutierrez.
Really?
And he was a young Mexican boy who came up here in order to make some money to build a wing on his house in Puebla. And of course he came up, through the tunnels and under the wire and through the desert, and lived with, I think, 7 or 8 of his friends, Mexican friends in Brooklyn, and worked on a housing construction in Brooklyn where the building collapsed and he drowned in concrete.
Oh, I think I remember that story.
Yes, and it's an incredible story. I just recently saw his father, who came up here, and what just was unbelievable is they're living 8 in a room. They have one little radio. They can't have a television set, even though there's 2 Spanish stations, because they have to give Social Security numbers, and they're all illegal.
That's another issue.
Is that interesting about how many things they can't do?
And if you don't have a Social Security number, you can't get a driver's license.
Right.
So that the whole question of, but once you are in American territory, you have constitutional rights. And this is what people often do not understand. And so one of the issues that we're involved in is trying to protect the constitutional rights of people who are in the United States, who are, by and large, as you suggest, very hardworking people who contribute to our economy, and yet they are today victimized by government, by their white neighbors, by
their employers.
By their employers. I mean, it's really horrible. So that's one of the things that we are very much engaged with.
The Bush had a plan, an immigration plan. What was that? That was to give temporary status to
Exactly. And I think the concern on the part of many people was that if you were here, if you're working here, because I've given you a letter as an employer, Ronnie, and you've got to work for me for 3 years.
Right.
I think that I've got tremendous control over you.
Without protection, right.
Because if I'll tear up that letter, and you'll have to go home if you in any way complain or do not do what I want you to do. And so I think that was a concern on the part of many people, that there is no protection, and that it really does put employers, gives them enormous power over other human beings.
Well, they really are at such at the whim of anybody and everybody. It is. I have not heard it debated in the national election yet.
Well, it's apparently not going to become an issue at this point. It's sort of in the back burner.
What's going to make it an issue if more and more people become American citizens? The Mexican, more Latino population that's
I think the reason it
does it have the strong support of the Latino population that does vote? This
by
concept?
and large, although there are some who are concerned, who see it as threatening, as a danger to the wage base. And I think we have to be very, very sensitive to that concern. But you know, Puerto Ricans themselves continue to face lots of issues. It's not just immigrants. I was just involved in a conversation with someone around the third grade exam that.
This is the reading exam, the statewide reading exam.
Right, where a child will be left back if the child does not do well. And we still have Puerto Ricans who come here where the children do not speak English, are in the process of learning English, and many of them, apparently, were required to take this third grade high stakes exam and will be left back, which is
They had to take it in English.
They had to take it in English. I mean, I suspect that in the third grade, I would have flunked the English language arts exam. And but by the fourth and fifth grade, I was number one in my class. So I think it's unfortunate.
So when you grew up, there was no English spoken at home?
No.
No.
Oh, no. My Dominican mother and Puerto Rican father did not speak.
Are you the only child?
Yes.
Oh.
And so...
so you had to really learn it. And then when you went to school,
yeah.
Oh, you just got immersed in it? There was no bilingual education?
None whatsoever. And so it took a while. I went to a Catholic school. The nuns did not. But I don't think there was bilingual education in very many places, although historically in this country, for example, when the Germans were immigrants, there were German schools. But that did not exist when I went to school. And so it took a while for me to learn. But once I learned English, as you can tell, I managed to converse effectively.
Pretty well. So it's really interesting because the kids who are Puerto Ricans and had to take this test but don't speak English means they come from Spanish-speaking homes.
Yes.
They're homes that are hard to reach with what's happening in the world, really, unless you present it to them in Spanish. So what I'm trying to say is they would not be an organized, cohesive opposition to the third grade test.
Probably not.
Because they really most likely didn't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or assumed that their children would not be tested and held back in this fashion, which is an assumption I think most people would make because they were in classes to learn English.
So how many people do you think, how many children were affected by this? Do you have any idea?
I have no idea. I've written a letter to the chancellor asking for an opportunity to meet with him and try to find the facts. But it's an example of the fact that there are issues that continually confront Latinos in New York, in the Northeast, because the day labor issues in Freehold, New Jersey, many issues of civil rights, and it is sort of ironic that this is the 50th anniversary of Brown against the Board, in which civil rights was such an important issue 50 years ago. It continues to be an important issue, not just for African Americans, but for other groups. It's
also becoming an important issue for white America, a question of freedom of speech and ability to demonstrate or to do whatever you want, isn't it?
Exactly.
And censorship. I mean, they said today that Disney is not allowing the distribution of a film that Michael Moore made. It's staggering at what's happening in the world. So,
yeah, the courts are today much more conservative than they were 50 years ago. And we obviously have a government that is more conservative. And I think it makes it very, very difficult for all of us who are concerned about civil liberties and civil rights, but which is what makes what I do exciting.
Do you do the kind of census taking? I mean, are you satisfied with the representation of Latinos or Puerto Ricans in government or on the bench in the courts? I mean, is that...
We are involved in that. About 2 years ago, we issued a report about the number of Latino judges. We very much
what
involved.
Is that like?
Tremendous underrepresentation. Yeah. And we were also concerned, obviously, about making sure that Latinos get counted, because they did a pretty good job at the last census and suddenly found out that there were so many here. The reason no one believed it is because they never counted them correctly before. And so we are seeing a recognition. And with it, I think, comes political power. Going back to your question about why Bush may have raised the possibility of new laws regarding Mexican immigrants, I think it's because if there is the sense that Latinos are going to become a political power, I think with that will come a greater sensitivity to the rights of Latinos.
Yeah, I think so too. Are there tensions between different groups within the Latino community?
Sure.
Human nature supersedes everything, right?
Exactly. But I don't think it's a particularly major issue. I think more, in some instances, has been made of it than it merits. For example, we as a Puerto Rican organization represent Dominicans and Mexicans and others. Much of our constituency, in the sense of people who come to our fundraising events, are Latinos. So I think that is overrated. I think Latinos have a lot more in common than separates them.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think they do, but I think we all have more in common. The world is so depressing now. I'm glad to see you, and you're smiling, and you look happy, and everything. But you read the papers, and here we see, starving children here, and people making cake biscuits out of mud in Haiti, and we're fighting this war in Iraq. And what are we doing?
Yeah, it is terribly depressing.
Yeah.
But you know, we've got to believe. I mentioned Brown against the board, and 50 years ago.
So symbolically, you feel that was an important, incredible
absolutely. It talks about
issue.
the power of the law, and it talks about this country and the rule of law.
And equality.
And equality. 50 years ago, people said, I don't care what the law is, people are not going to change the way they behave.
Right.
White people will never accept black people.
Right.
Well, that's not true. 50 years later, we've seen tremendous change in this country. And so I want to make you optimistic, Ronnie.
Good. I think I need it. Let's talk about, we have this war and an army. It's a disproportionate army, isn't it, as far as people of color?
Yes. Oh, and when you see the faces on TV and elsewhere about the people who are dying, you see a disproportionate number of minorities.
Are you looking at that at all? I mean, I think it's, and some of them aren't even citizens.
That's right.
So they bestow honor, they bestow citizenship after you died. Remember the young man from
It happened recently here in New York.
Right. It would seem to me there's an interesting issue there.
It is an interesting issue, but it says two things to me. One is that some of the most oppressed and discriminated people in this country are the most patriotic. They want to be part of America and express that often by joining the armed forces. The other thing, though, it says to me is that Charlie Rangel is right. You've got to establish the draft again. It is not fair that it is only the poor who joined the armed forces because it's an opportunity to get an education, to earn a living.
Or a vocation.
And the middle class does not have to do that. And so the middle class decision makers in our country don't hesitate to go to war because it's not going to affect them personally. And I think that's what's wrong with what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I'm glad that you prefaced it with patriotism because that shows your optimism and my pessimism, and I would say it's a job and a way to find what to do when you get to be 18 or 19 years old and you haven't got a job. And hopefully you finish school. I don't know. Do you have to be a high school graduate to be in the Army? I don't think so.
I don't know.
But I think the recruiting in high schools and the promises that it brings are very hard. And especially we saw it with the National Guard. These are people who need more money, basically, it seems to me, and have done it in order to supplement income. And now they're out there fighting, and they're having terrible times at home because their jobs don't wait for them, and they've got families that they need to feed. So it is an interesting area, and I think it's a very important. What other issues do you see that you're going to?
Well, there are all kinds of issues, and for example,
you're working closely with the other legal services groups, the other special groups.
Right. We are especially close to the Asian American Legal Defense Fund because they share a floor with us.
That's good.
in our building. But I was about to say another good example is the fact that a lot of the cleanup work after the 9/11 was outside of the pit, was in apartment buildings and office buildings outside of the direct area that was hit. And those contractors who got those jobs hired many, many Latino laborers. There was no protection for these people. They were exposed to asbestos. They were exposed to the remains of what happened after that horrible event. And many of them today are sick, but they do not get any benefits. And so we're dealing with a large group of laborers who cleaned up after 9/11, but who are not seen in the same way as, you know, the heroes that went into the pit, and yet they are very, very ill, and they're suffering, and that is the kind of issue that we often.
So now, we have less than a minute, but how do you fund this operation?
Well, I am trying very much to raise money. One of the reasons I came back to the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund is because we do have some really serious financial problems, and I think we are trying every way we can to appeal to our constituency, to appeal to the public, to support the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and we are constantly looking for people who will make donations.
Well, I hope you find many of them, and I hope you continue to grow and to play the important role you're playing, and thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Ronnie.
Thank you.